There was an anniversary this week that was celebrated, and the anniversary was 10 years of Hurricane Katrina hitting New Orleans and Mississippi. Now, New Orleans got all of the publicity because there were so many people that are there, but the actual eye of the storm, which is the center of the hurricane and what is known as ground zero, actually hit two areas, Waveland and Bay St. Louis of Mississippi. And we happened to take a mission trip there to go to help the people out. And it was pretty amazing because it's one of those things where you don't realize the power and the impact of a hurricane because we live in Ohio and they don't hit here often. In fact, none, I checked it last night to make sure, but no hurricanes have actually hit Ohio off the Great Lake Erie that is just above us. So we don't have any way of understanding, and yet it's funny because whenever there's hurricanes, there's always that one guy that has to stay, and there's the camera that's on him, and he's going to be the tough guy, and the winds are blowing sideways, and he's getting knocked over, and you're watching this guy, and as a parent, you're praying, please don't let that be my kid. You know, I don't want to see him on YouTube later, and for someone else, you're thinking, that is somebody's kid, and I hope he's going to be okay. And we watch the footage, but even on TV, there's just no real way of understanding the damage and the force that a hurricane has and how it can completely change an area literally in an instant. Areas that have been here for hundreds and thousands of years, in one hurricane can be changed, boom, just like that. And so for those of you who don't know, the two strongest hurricanes ever have hit this area, this New Orleans, Mississippi area. The fastest winds ever recorded were Camille, which hit in 1969. So fast that the equipment that they had at that time to measure the wind speed, they were destroyed as it hit, and it was something like 169 miles an hour when it hit landfall. And then also, probably, I don't know, 100 miles inland, there was a sustained 120 mile an hour winds that were taking place. But all the equipment was gone, so they couldn't really get an accurate read as to just how fast the winds were blowing. And then Katrina, which hit however many years later, this was the largest storm as far as size to ever hit the United States. It actually hit Florida. It kept right on going through the Gulf of Mexico. It hit land 3 different times, and then it started back out. They thought it was going to go back out, and it didn't. It came back because it came rushing back with a vengeance. And the damage of that was in the $118 billion range. So it was the greatest storm as far as the amount, as far as dollars and the size. And so you hear those numbers and you think, okay, that's a lot of money and I can't really imagine. And you hear the size of the storm, and yet we still can't really get our arms around something like that because we weren't there. And so I'm going to show you part of a video today, and if you just take a few minutes here so you can watch and maybe understand some of the impact that took place when Hurricane Katrina hit. He's going to take the volume down here for a little bit, and he's going to let the video continue. Go ahead and take the volume all the way down, Ray. He's going to let the video continue, and as you can see, the devastation that is here, you can't recognize anything. All you can see is everything just strewn and thrown about. It was amazing because we would drive down the road and we would see a forest, and in the middle of the trees you'd see a boat standing straight up either face down or face up, and there's no way to get that boat out unless you cut all of the trees down and then come back to get it. And so it's literally going to stay there, and some of those are still there to this day because no one has the money, no one has the manpower, no one even has the desire to go and fix that. And so when you come into something like this, you're looking around and the devastation is so amazing that you're like, how in the world can this ever recover? And so they shared with us when we were down there that, you know, it's going to take at least a decade for things to get back to normal. And when we say 10 years, you think about that and you think, oh, what's the big deal? You know, that doesn't seem like that long. Or you think, wow, that really does seem like an extended period of time. You know, what can happen in 10 years? And if they're just picking these things up, why can't it be back to normal in 10 years? And yet here we are 10 years later, and if you're watching any of the news and the forecasts that are, any of the news and the stories that are online right now, you'll see that a lot of this stuff is cleaned up, but a lot of it still isn't. The major thing, though, that happened that is the most devastating is that in New Orleans, in what's known as the 9th Ward, there is an actual place where 100,000 people lived in this 9th Ward, and less than 10,000 of them have come back because the government gave them the money to move away, but most of them were blue-collar, working-class people, and they didn't have the money to come back. So because of that, many of these neighborhoods still sit barren. They just sit open and they sit there. And this is what it looked like when we got down there. And if you'll notice on the houses, and some of the houses, you'll actually see an X that's on there, and they actually have necklaces and t-shirts and things like that they sell that are down there still, because that signifies what they found in the houses, because they had to go from house to house to see if they found anyone that had died. And so this is the devastation that they had to get through to get to that house. And one's going to come up here shortly, and on the bottom part, you're going to actually see the number 1 right here. And that means that they literally found a person in that house. And there were houses that we went into, and we found the fingernails that had scratched all the way down as they were trying to climb out, as they were trying to get to higher ground, as they were trying to get to a place to where there would be safety. And yet for some people, that never came. Now, don't get me wrong. These people were told to evacuate. And that's what happened when the 911 calls were coming. And they told them this was a forced evacuation. You had to get out. We were not messing around. This was serious. And sadly, some people chose, nope, I'm going to stay through it. And some of them they chose because they decided, since they got through Hurricane Camille, which was the fastest, hardest hurricane, that they said, okay, we can get through this one as well. But they had no idea just how much devastation would take place. And so these are the pictures that we took. And these are the pictures from the time that we were down here. But there's things that took place within this group. At this time, I was a youth pastor, and you're going to start to see coming up here some of the people that were on this youth trip with me, this missions trip with me that we went on there. And the amazing thing is that some of them are your kids' age, or some of them are the ages of the kids that are sitting here now. They were 16, 17, 18 years of age, 15 years old. And there are also leaders that were with them that took the time, because our job was to rebuild, and our job was to take somebody's favorite toy and put it into a trash pile. Our job was to come together and somehow find something positive within this time. And yet the place was so barren that many times it meant to not deal or to work or to see anybody, not one human being, because they weren't there anymore. But then every once in a while, we would find someone, and they would meet with us, and they would grab a hold of us and say, the only people that are coming, the only people that are here for us are the church. The government sits just outside the state with trailer after trailer after trailer that they can't get through because of red tape. And yet the church comes willing, and the church comes to offer resources. The church comes to offer materials. The church comes to offer people. We're going to post this video later, so if you'd like to watch the rest of the video. But the idea behind the video is this, is that here's this young lady, her name is Marissa, and she is running within this video. And the story centers around the Good Samaritan. And that so often we are running through life, and we are running through life, and we are running through life, and there's all kinds of destruction all the way around us. And we make a choice with that destruction. And too many times we choose to walk across the road to the other side. Or too many times we choose to run past it with everything that is behind us. Or too many times we're so stuck in our own world that nothing else matters. And the amazing thing is, when this takes place, this destruction does not go away. The amazing thing is that as people's lives are falling apart or have fallen apart around us, that they need someone who's going to stop long enough to recognize where they are. But too many times in our lives, we are so stuck in who we are and where we are that we don't take the time to reach out and to love someone, to care for someone, to reach out to the single mom who is doing everything she can to raise her child or her children, to reach out to someone who may have some type of medical procedure and you just need a phone call to say, I care. To reach out to a couple that we know is struggling. To reach out to a guy or gal that all they want is that someone that is next to them, to sit with them maybe in church, or to find that special someone within their lives. And it could be as simple as putting our arm around our children, our grandchildren, and just reaching out to them. And then a year goes on, 5 years go on, and the next thing you know, it's a decade. And all we've done is run and run and run. Some churches today are against short-term mission trips. And as you watch the video here, I am sharing this with you because I am completely for them. Because in this video, you see a lot of teenagers who had an opportunity to go and love others and help others and care for others. But just like you and just like me, a decade has gone by for these people. A decade to where they've gone from teenagers to young adults. A decade to where they've had an opportunity to live their faith or to leave their faith. A decade where they've had the opportunity to run away from God or to run along with God. And in that last decade, it's the same opportunity that you and I have had every single day. Ray's going to go ahead and pause this video here. These are some of the faces, and some of them you may recognize. You may have seen some of the people that are sitting here today, and some of you may not, because it was a decade ago. But through all the people that took the time to go on this missions trip, this is part of who they are. This is part of their life, and what we share on each one of our mission trips. But these are God moments that you and I get to create. And because it was very rare that we would ever see anyone, there were God moments that we had a chance to help people to rebuild. We had a chance to help people to restore. But we also had a chance with one another to help our relationships to grow, and at the end of the day, to decide whether or not to recognize God within those relationships. And that's something that has never, ever changed. The people you're sitting with right now, the people you're sitting next to, the people that you come because this is a place that you believe. Well, why do you believe? And what is it that you believe? Because you're going to have an opportunity in your workplaces, and you're going to have an opportunity as we start back to school. You're going to have an opportunity as you head out to school for college students. You're going to have an opportunity every single day to live what you believe. Are you taking that opportunity? Are you living that opportunity? Or do you just keep going day by day by day with all the destruction around you, and you're so stuck in everything that's taken place that you can't even see God within the moments? Because that is a choice that you and I make. To visualize God and to see Him there with us, and to realize that God didn't change, we did. and that God didn't turn his back on us, that we turned our back on him, and that God never stepped away, that it was us that chose to step away. And we get so stuck in rules, in tradition, and how it's always been. Sometimes within the law, sometimes of how that has been, that we don't focus on the here and now and our future with God walking alongside of us and us recognizing him in that. And this has taken place since the very beginning of the church, which is where we're going to dive in today. Acts chapter 15. Jacob has a reading that he has to do for the summer. And the book that he had to read was called This I Believe. I'm not recommending the book. I just noticed the title of This I Believe. This I Believe. And so as I was studying this week and reading about this, there were certain things I said, this I believe. This I believe. Because there's going to be many times within our walk that we're going to have the opportunity to step up for our faith. Sometimes that means being quiet before the Lord. Sometimes that means, just as Jesus did, to go and take the time to pray. Many times it means to be praying without ceasing, to be putting on the full armor of God every single day for the renewing of our minds, to be transformed by his word and transformed by his love, and not conformed to what this world says. But all of those things took place because of what you're about to read and what you're about to hear today. This is known as the Council at Jerusalem. This is the first council to ever take place. And this is church business meeting that takes place where everyone comes together and they have to make the decision as to what they believe. And so beginning at the beginning of chapter 15, this is how it starts. And it says, some men came down from Judea to Antioch and were teaching the brothers. Let's stop here for a second. If you go in and dive into Antioch, Antioch is a very key place when it comes to Christianity. Because before Christians were Christians, they were known by the way that they lived. They were known as people that didn't walk past the destruction. They were known as people that gave everything they had to help others. They were known as people that would give monetarily, that would give of their time, that would give of everything that they have to help others and care for others. They would give of their faith and they would give of their hearts. And so before they were known as Christians, they were known as the way. In fact, Christian, that term you can first read, was given in the city of Antioch in Acts chapter 11 at the end of it. And when that term was given as Christian, it was considered derogatory. It was a slap in the face. At no time did Jesus ever come and say, hey, I'm starting a club, I'm starting a gang, we're going to have our own signs, we're going to have our own colors, all that kind of stuff. We're going to call ourselves Christians. Come and follow me and be part of the gang. That never happened. It was after he was gone. It was after he was resurrected. It was after he had left. And all these people are out trying to start what is now the modern day church. It was at that point that they gave them the title Christians, and it was to mock them and to make fun of them. And so they're doing everything they can to fight for this name and to try and turn that negative into a positive. Which with our faith, that's, Lord willing, that's something that we are trying to do. We're trying to be a reflection of him. We're trying to imitate Christ, just as Paul imitated Christ. And the other apostles and the other disciples imitated Christ, so that people can see something through us as we are that reflection of him. It says, so they came down to Antioch, were teaching, brothers, unless you are circumcised according to the custom taught by Moses, you cannot be saved. This dispute brought Paul and Barnabas into sharp dispute and a debate with them. So Paul and Barnabas were appointed, along with some other believers, to go to Jerusalem to see the apostles and the elders about this question. So there's this question that's arising, and with all the things as far as what they believe, that all of a sudden these guys are coming and saying, that came out to start teaching, oh, by the way, Paul and Barnabas, what it is that you're doing and what it is you're teaching, it's not quite good enough. And so, yeah, that whole Jesus dying on the cross and resurrecting and all that kind of stuff and coming back, and we all saw him, it's pretty cool stuff, but we got to still keep with some of these things within the law. So we're going to teach some of the law tied in with that love. We're going to add that to it. And so Paul and Barnabas stood up and said, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to take those steps because you are missing what it is that God is trying to share with you in your life. And so here's Paul and Barnabas, and Paul and Barnabas are complete opposites. Paul had a cackling voice. He was balding. He was a smaller guy. He was blinded at one time. Most likely when it talks about the thorn in his side that you find out about in Galatians, the fact that thorn may be the fact that he could not see, so he had people that wrote for him. But it was something that he had to deal with for his entire life. Let me just stop here for a second and say, this is not a thing to pray for. Hey, God, would you give me a thorn in my side? Because you're allowing the devil to step in at that point. God doesn't want to give you a thorn in the side. He wants you to live life abundantly. Those are things we need to be praying for and reaching out to God for. And then there's this guy named Barnabas. I'm going to give you 3 names here real quick. If I say to you, Clark Kent, Peter Parker, and Bruce Wayne, they're not nearly as exciting as when I say Superman, Spider-Man, and Batman. That's how we know these guys. And so if I ask you, which one would you rather be, Clark Kent, Peter Parker, or Bruce Wayne? Most of us would choose Bruce Wayne because we know that he's a billionaire. Right? And by the way, this is my little Batman diatribe. I'm going to get off the beaten path. I know this is hard to believe, but the guy's a billionaire. And so whenever he drives around, it's not like he's driving a Pinto, or a beat-up minivan, with flames on it and the hydraulics are, it's all falling apart and rusted out and all that stuff. He's always driving a fancy car. So if a guy shows up with the coolest car on the planet, the Batmobile, wouldn't you just figure that it was the billionaire? And yet he puts something over half his face and no one knows who he is. It always bothered me. He's got all the great cars. It has to be Bruce Wayne. All right, there we go. Anyway. Which would you choose? If you can be Clark Kent, you can be a newspaper writer. You can be Peter Parker. You can be an average teenage kid living in the roughest part of town. Or you can be Bruce Wayne, who is all alone in this huge billionaire mansion. Which would you choose? We don't really know them as that, do we? Now, if I stop you and say, would you rather be Superman, Spider-Man, or Batman? Now all of a sudden it changes, doesn't it? I have the ability to fly, and I got a cool cape. I can shoot a web, and I can shoot anywhere I want. Or once again, with Batman, I get to drive a really cool car. But see, we know them as these people. We don't think about who they really are. With Barnabas, Barnabas is not what we know as Barnabas. This is the name that was given to him that tied into his name. And many times when you read names in the Bible, there's either a Greek side or a Hebrew side. And so for Barnabas, when they share Barnabas, his name literally means son of encouragement. And so when everyone saw Barnabas, or Barnabas was there, he is always encouraging. He is always giving. And anytime you read about him, that's what he's doing. We sold some land. We gave everything to church. We gave it to others so it would help others, to care for others before there was a church. He's always going in. He has encouraging words. So when Paul is here, he's ready to fight, and Barnabas is ready to encourage. Paul's ready to say, I'm going to cut you. And Barnabas is like, but it's going to be a really nice cut. We'll just put a couple stitches right there. You won't even notice anything. Jesus loves you. And they would move on with their life. So here's Paul and Barnabas. And so some guys are yelling, and Paul's wanting to engage with it. And Barnabas is just like, listen, let's just encourage them and love them. But we need guys like that in our lives that are ready to step up, but that are also ready to encourage. So Paul and Barnabas realize that this is something that they need not take to these people because they're not going to listen. So it says the church sent them on their way, and as they traveled through Phoenicia and Samaria, I'm in verse 3 by the way, they were told how the Gentiles had been converted. They told how the Gentiles had been converted. If you're not a Jew, you're a Gentile. So if you're not from Jerusalem, you're not one of the chosen people, you are a Gentile. It says, this news made all the brothers very glad. When they came to Jerusalem, they were welcomed by the church and the apostles and elders, to whom they reported everything God had done through them. God had worked through them. We are on a missionary journey because God is at work. The son of encouragement in this guy that's going to stand up for his faith. God is working through them, and I cannot wait to share it with you. And just as soon as they share their story, this person got saved at camp. These are people's lives that we touched on the mission trip. This is someone who finally had enough, and they said, this is a place that I can come because I believe and I belong. This is the study that I'm a part of through my work. I'm a student, and I stood up for creation at school, and my science teacher is going to be mad at me for the rest of the year, and I'm going to love him or her no matter what. Just when they share this great victory, because many times when we have the greatest victory, all of a sudden there's opposition. Then, the next thing that happens, some of the believers who belonged to the party of the Pharisees stood up and said, and we'll stop here for a second, then some of the believers and they were Pharisees. That means that they were Jewish. That means that these were guys that the entire time they've been teaching about the Old Testament. They've been teaching about the law. They've been teaching about all the things that Moses wrote about. But they realized, oh my goodness, we were looking for a Messiah. And all this time we were looking for someone to come in and take over the world. And then this guy showed up, and all he did was love us just like we are. And all he did was care for us. And all he did was heal. Heal the blind and heal the deaf and those that couldn't walk. And every sign that pointed to the Messiah pointed directly to Jesus. And oh my goodness, did we miss the boat. And yet, there was still something that they were holding on to. The most religious of all the religious ones was still holding on to. And this is what it was. The Gentiles, meaning us, must be circumcised and required to obey the law of Moses. Now this is a huge thing. The believers, those that stepped forward, had to be circumcised to be a believer and to obey the law. And I cannot even believe not one guy is rolling their eyes or thinking, oh my goodness, you've got to be kidding me. Because if that were a requirement, that would mean every time someone comes forward, the pastor gets to check them out to make sure that they're circumcised. I can't wait to go to seminary. Sign me up. Or, if they're not, then the pastor has to perform the circumcision. All the women are laughing now. Nudging their husband next to them. We're starting to get this little impact now. We're starting to understand it. Let's think about this for a second. Your kid goes off to lift camp. They go off to Round Lake. And they call you up. Guess what, Mom and Dad? They're asking me what our insurance company is. Do we have a copay? And kids are posting on Twitter. Hey, just got circumcised. Hey, I'm about to get circumcised. Just be honest here for a second. Would that be just the slightest bit weird to any of you? Yeah. This is what they're calling for. Okay, so does everyone understand this? There's some major impact going on. And this major impact that is taking place has the ability to affect the very church that you sit in today. It comes into where, listen, we used to just play an organ, or we used to just play a piano. And now there's drums and there's a guitar. Listen, we can't sing something unless it's written before 1850, because that's more along the lines of what it says in the hymnals. Listen, we can't be teaching from just the Old Testament. We have to go Old Testament and New Testament each time. Listen, there's law after law after law that we must follow. And there's requirements after requirements after requirements. And these guys just got done hearing about all these people taking a step of faith, and now they want to require them to be circumcised. And so Paul and Barnabas, the cackler and the encourager, are back, and they're sharing all these great things, but it wasn't enough, was it? It just wasn't enough. And so the very next verse, it says, the apostles and elders met to consider this question. After much discussion, Peter got up and addressed them. Brothers, you know that some time ago, God made a choice among you that the Gentiles might hear from my lips the message of the gospel and believe. Let's stop here for a second. If you grew up Catholic, Peter was it. Peter was the man. He is the one that all Catholic churches, they point to. So if Peter doesn't step up at this time, the Catholic Church as we know it does not take place. It just doesn't happen. And for many other churches, for Paul and for Barnabas and for all those that came along, these guys that are saints, if they don't step up, then how we sit and where we sit today doesn't happen. And so Peter, who is the rock that the church was built on, gets up and addresses me. He says, brothers, you know he made this choice. He says, God, who knows the heart, showed that he accepted them by giving the Holy Spirit to them just as he did to us. He made no distinction between us and them, for he purified their hearts by faith. Now then, why do you try to test God by putting on the necks of the disciples a yoke that neither we nor our fathers have been able to bear? See, those requirements that they're talking about in the Old Testament, there's not 10 commandments. There's over 600. You can't walk 25 feet to the right on a Sunday. You can't walk 25 feet back to the left on a Sunday. You can't carry more than something that weighs more than 20 pounds. If somebody's animal is stuck in a ditch, you have to allow it to be stuck in the ditch until the next day. You can't wear a certain color. You can't wear plaid. You can't go to drive-in movies. You can't dance. You can't sing. Stay away from the drums. On and on and on and on. And so this yoke that they had to bear, Peter's basically saying to them, it didn't work out for you, and yet you want to put that on somebody else. And so many times when it comes to the church, this is what we tend to do. The people from 10 years and 15 years and 20 years and 50 years ago, they couldn't do it, and now you're expecting me to do it, and oh, on top of it, let me add this to you. Because that's what we've always done, and that's how we've always done it. Wake up, because a decade is going to go by, and you're going to look back and go, why, oh why, oh why did I do that? Why did I put my yoke onto others? Why did I weigh them down with this yoke? Why is it that over and over and over, what I chose in my way because of how everybody else did it, wore them out to the point to where they're no longer coming. They're no longer seeking God. They're no longer living their faith. In fact, they're running with blinders on, with all of the destruction around them, and they no longer even care. And Peter stops here, and this is what he says. No. He just stops. He literally says, no, that's enough. That's enough of you trying to do what the church has always done and trying to act the way that others have acted and holding on to all these rules and everything about it. That is enough. You need to let go and let God and allow God to work, because that same Holy Spirit, that counselor, that teacher, that provider that we can turn to at all times, that will guide us through faith, that sits with us and lives with us in every step that we take, that is what God promised. When will you let go of this world to focus upon God's Word? It says, no, we believe, you and I, we believe, this I believe, it is through grace of our Lord, it's through the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ that we are saved just as they are. And he sits down. And everyone has to let it soak in, because right at this point it becomes very, very silent. And so now Paul and Barnabas get back up and they start sharing all the great things again. And when they get done sharing all these great things that happen, and some people probably think, oh, we already heard this, but the Pharisees are probably listening for the very first time. And then this happens next in verse 13. When they finished, James spoke up. Now, James is the half-brother of Jesus. So James grew up with Jesus. And James has heard his entire life, why can't you be more like your older brother? James is coming home from school. Oh, Mom, seriously, we're in science class today, and Jesus changed the water to wine again. And everyone thought it was some kind of compound thing, and they're trying to have us prove it. And I went down to the final thing, and I wrote, Jesus did it, and I got an F on the paper. And Jesus just laughed and laughed and laughed. James did not believe until this moment. He stood next to his mom, and he watched his brother die the most excruciating death you could die on a cross. And then 3 days later, his brother showed up and said, "What's up, James?" Lots of destruction around, isn't there? That whole Messiah thing that everyone's been looking for. Here I am. You ready to step up and start living your faith? And then James did what only James does in this Bible. And this book of James was a book that was fought on over and over and over as to whether or not it should even be in the Bible. But James says things like, be a doer of the word and not a hearer only. And James says things like, if you draw close to me, I will draw close to you, which is what God says. And James challenges over and over and over. So James is a guy that he's like, put up or shut up. And these are the guys that are all around. And so James says this, Simon, brothers, listen to me. Simon has described to us how God at first showed us his concern by taking from the Gentiles a people for himself. The words of the prophets are in agreement with this, as it is written. See, there is no New Testament this time. The only testament they have is the Old Testament. And when James addresses Peter, he addresses him as Simon, because James is the leader of the church in Jerusalem. And Peter and Paul and everyone have been sent out into all these different areas to go out and reach others. So when he addresses him as the Jews would address him. Simon and Peter are the same person. Once again, the Greek and the Hebrew. And Simon is just a different way of saying Simeon, who's one of the tribes of Judah, one of the tribes of Israel. So here is James, and he is stepping up and he's like, let's talk about what Simon is saying. And so they make this agreement. They're like, man, there's 630 commandments. It's too tough for us all to keep. None of us can even really realize it's way too much. And so they decide, after everything, you know what we'll do? We're going to write him a letter. Because this is how God's word was passed on at that time. Paul's already been on a missionary journey. He's already planted churches. He's already reached out to people that have been looking for this Messiah. All of a sudden they realize he was here. He's sharing all these great things, and how he died on the cross, and how he rose again from the dead, and how he appeared to people. And everything they were looking for is right there before them. And in your toughest moment, everything that you're looking for is right there before you. You get so stuck, and I get so stuck on all of the destruction around us that we don't recognize God within the moment. And because of that, we don't recognize eternity. We recognize who we are, but not whose we are. And so James says, let's write a letter to these believers. And starting in verse 22, this is the letter that's written. Then the apostles and elders with the whole church decided to choose some of their own men and send them to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas. They chose Judas, called Barsabbas, and Silas, two men who were leaders among the brothers. So they send these two Jewish guys out, these two Jewish leaders with Paul and Barnabas, with the cackler, with the guy who's in your face, and with the encourager. And it says, with them they sent the following letter. The apostle and elders, your brothers, to the Gentile believers of Antioch, Syria, and Cilicia. So in other words, this is the group of guys that are writing this. Who are this group of guys? We talked about them. There was Peter. There was James. There was Paul. And there was Barnabas. And when you hear those names, for many of us, it's just a name to us. Peter, the rock of this church, the rock of the New Testament church, the reason that we are celebrating and worshiping today. The guy that denied Christ 3 times. And believers may be having this discussion with them. Man, there was Peter there. Oh my goodness, that's the rock. He's amazing. Yeah, but you know what? I don't know if I can really believe in Peter because he denied Christ 3 times. He did, but Jesus came back for him. As a believer, we need to step up to make sure that we're focusing on God within this, because other people aren't going to see it if we're not walking and talking and living our faith. Who else was there? Oh, man, James. Oh, Jesus' brother? Yeah, that guy wasn't even anywhere around, and he saw him die, and he didn't even believe in Jesus till after he died. Yeah, but it took that for him to wake up. Who else? Oh, well, you know what? Paul was there. Yeah, that Paul guy, before when they called him Saul and everything, he was out killing people and all that, and he's got an annoying voice, and I don't really know that I'm 100% sold on him. But Jesus met him on the road to Damascus, and he blinded him. And he said, he said, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And Saul literally saw the light. And then Barnabas. Oh, Barnabas, man, that guy, whenever he's around, he encourages everyone. I love having a guy like that in my life. And yet of the 4 names, he is the name that we recognize the least. And yet throughout Scripture, over and over and over, he gives and he gives and he gives. And so this is the letter that these 4 guys wrote to the Gentile believers. It says, greetings. We have heard that some went out from us without our authorization and disturbed you, troubling your minds by what they said. So we all agreed to choose some men and send them to you with our dear friends Barnabas and Paul, men who have risked their lives. Have you ever thought about how Christianity became Christianity? because they just said this in one sentence as to what it is that these guys were willing to do. They were willing to risk their lives. Every city that they went into, if they had different believers or a different belief system, they could have been stoned. In fact, Paul was stoned one time. They thought he was dead, and they dropped his body out, and all of a sudden, boom, he comes walking back in. Everyone's like, whoa, what's going on here? John, they tried to kill over and over and over, and he wouldn't die, so they finally sent him to an island. But everywhere that they went, they risked their lives. And yet our faith is so feeble and so weak. If one person turns to us and says, well, why is it that God killed people in the Old Testament? We're like, I don't know. I can't support a God like that. Good one, good one. Okay, I'm going to move on with our life. And we stop. No. For this I believe, that through God's grace, you and I may be saved. I don't know all the laws, but I know that I'm loved. There's destruction everywhere around me, but I'm going to start focusing upon my faith. Because if these guys risk their lives, isn't it something that we can risk a conversation with? To risk a conversation and say, man, I was the biggest loser. I was the biggest idiot. I had the worst addiction. I struggled so badly, but that was in my past. And I don't know what happened. But God said, you're worth it. And through His grace, I believe. Because He's made such a change in me. I don't know all the laws. I don't know all the commandments. I know there's 10 of them. I probably couldn't write down 2. And you're all in that same boat. But I know this. I'm loved. But our faith is so feeble. We start dating someone that doesn't really believe in God. We start dating someone that doesn't really go to church. We start dating someone that instills their belief system on us, and we don't stand up at all. We take it because I might be lonely. Our boss, who we know is completely lost, that we just need to love and to love more, they instill every belief that they have upon us. And we don't love them back. We just turn away. Co-workers who swear and take the Lord's name in vain over and over and over, and we allow it everywhere we go. I was in a frozen food section one time, and this lady who was with probably her 4- and 5-year-old children says, GD it, you get your A over here. And so I walked over to her, and she's like, who are you? I'm like, why are you so mad at God? And you just told me to get over here. And she's like, what do you mean? I go, you just said GD it. And she said, I am so sorry. I said, don't apologize to me. It's God's name you took in vain. You didn't say John stole it. Jesus loves you. I'd love to see you all in the frozen food section later. Let's just go around and do that. But there are moments where we get to step up for our faith and say, no, because this I believe. If these guys risk their lives, if the rock of the church, if the encourager, if the cackler, if the guy who's going to step up and say, show me your faith, the cackler, by the way, is the missionary. If those guys are willing to step up for their faith, how much then can we do the same? In a conversation, in a talk, around a dinner table as we're invited, at the water cooler, in our office, in our hallways, in the lunchroom. Because if we don't, a decade's going to go by. And whereas most of the destruction is going to be gone, not all of it is. But it takes a team to make the decision to start one brick at a time, one piece of wood at a time, a piece of debris at a time. And for those that are running, to stop them enough to say, enough. Because it is your faith when you trust and believe. It is your faith when you step up to love others as Christ loves you. And it is your faith when you choose to make disciples in His name. And it is your faith when you say, no, enough is enough. This is what I believe. And so James and them finish the letter with this. Therefore, we are sending Judas and Silas to confirm by word of mouth that what we are writing. It seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us not to burden you with anything beyond the following requirements. Remember, the Pharisee said, these are the requirements, not commandments. Not commandments. God makes commandments. Man makes requirements. He says, you are to abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from the meat of strangled animals, and from sexual immorality. You will do well to avoid these things. Farewell. That's the whole letter. That's it. So he gives 4 requirements. Not 630, but 4. These requirements are to bring the two together. And he's saying this: abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from the meat of strangled animals, which, by the way, was really weird, and I didn't understand why until I studied it. And the reason you don't eat roadkill or strangled animals is because in their mind it was not set up the right way. So you need to cut the animal first and let it bleed out completely before you serve the meat. And if some of you are like, well, how is it that the Jewish people can eat steak raw, rare? It's because they soak it in salt water first. That makes it kosher because it takes out the blood. Pretty cool, huh? But that's why they stay away from this, because this brings the two bodies together. And so this is that requirement. And the last thing it says is, and avoid sexual immorality. Because in this culture, it was okay to just go around and sleep around. It was okay to mess around. It was okay to have a website where millions of people can cheat on one another and not think anything about it. And yet we know those are wrong. And we understand that those are wrong. But everything that he required them came down to 2 things: food and sex. Food and sex. And when we struggle, guess where the 2 areas we still go to? We're a glutton in some areas, and we go into other areas we should never be in. But at some point, at some time, we have to say to ourselves before a loving God, no. Because this I believe, that your grace is enough for me, and your grace I can pass on to others. Ray, if you would start the video again, please just go ahead and play it. I threw Ray off there. Sorry about that. If you'd hold that picture right there. At one point in one time, these are just young teenagers. And there were people that were in their lives, whether they were youth leaders, youth pastor, or pastor, that reached out to them because they were worth loving. And a decade ago, they were wide-eyed, they were bushy-tailed, they were ready to go, they were ready to care for others. And do you know what's happened to them in 10 years? Life's gotten in the way. Some have been married, some divorced. Some have had kids out of wedlock. Some have dealt with the very things that we deal with today when it comes to the struggle with homosexuality and other areas that we miss the Lord. Some have been in gangs. Some have completely left the faith. And yet when I posted this yesterday on Facebook and I tagged everyone that I could tag on it, you'd be amazed at the comments coming back. Do you remember this? Do you remember this? Do you remember this? Which to me was saying God moment after God moment after God moment after God moment. And I would say to them, just as I say to you, 10 years ago, so many people ran past this destruction. And you stopped along the way for long enough to pick a piece of debris up at a time. To put your arms around someone and hold hands with them and lift your voice and your heart to the Lord. To say, no, I'm not going to put up with what the world has to say. Instead, I'm going to live in God's love, because this I believe. Through His grace, I am saved. And for most of them, and for many of you, you never stop being a child of God. But until you have a Paul that's alongside of you that's not afraid to say, listen, I see this in your rearview mirror. I see this in your blind spot. Be careful. Until you have a Barnabas who is willing to encourage you and to be alongside of you. Until you have a James who says, put up or shut up. And until you have a Peter that says, at the end of the day, it comes back to your faith. You're going to keep making excuses. You're going to keep pointing fingers. You're going to forget the very central verse of the Bible, which is Psalm 118:8, where it says it's better to put your trust, your refuge in the Lord than in man, because we're all going to fail you at times. Until you have those people in your lives, you're going to continue to run and run and run. And you're going to run past all the destruction. And you're going to continue to take your destruction with you because you haven't stepped up enough to give it to God. You haven't stepped up enough to have the right people in your lives that you can turn to. In school, at work, in your community, in your church family. You aren't taking the time to do those very things for others. You don't really believe when it says you're now entering your mission field as you leave our church. And most of all, just as we saw last Sunday night, we don't stop in a circle, put our hands together. We don't stop and lift our voice. We don't take that time and be quiet before the Lord and pray. And pray. And pray. And say, Lord, this I believe. It is through your grace that I am your child. And that you tell me I can call you Heavenly Father. This I believe. This I believe. This I believe. Would you stand, please, so we can close in a word of prayer?